Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story has intrigue, heists, and dragon eggs. It's written by Jessica Deen Norris, who grew up playing with Ninja Turtles as much as Barbie dolls. She was born and raised in Louisiana and still lives there with her husband and 5 children. Their hearts for adoption led them to adopt their youngest son from China, who was born blind, but hasn't let that slow him down. As a former junior high and high school English teacher, she's now living out her dream of being an author. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Jessica. For now, please enjoy Behind the Shadow Knight's Mask by Jessica Deen Norris. Chapter 1. The large, soulless black eyes of the mask mocked Aurelia. They questioned her, accused her, and gave her a strange sense of comfortable anonymity. She pulled the deep purple hood over her wavy black hair and stared in the mirror. Massive eyes gazed back at her, the eyes of a shadow knight. Her tan skin peeked out from beneath a pointed nose, the fine lines around her mouth beginning to show her age. It was unnerving how she instantly relaxed into the robes. Aurelia shook her head. Fear and pain. That's what they should convey to her, nothing more. She glanced across the room. Her 16-year-old ward, Lucy, slept peacefully in the corner. Her small frame was curled beneath a blanket, with a few red curls peeking out. The girl had vehemently protested staying in Xanthias, where it was safe. Aurelia reluctantly agreed to let her come along, but she hadn't allowed Lucy to be part of the mission tonight, despite the girl's objections. A small smile crept across Aurelia's face. Her determination would be useful one day. Aurelia caught one last glance of the Shadow Knight in the mirror. Under the mask, her smile was uncanny. She frowned. It wasn't the time to be sentimental. Aurelia grabbed her pouch and left, the robes flowing out behind her. As she stepped out into the night, a warm breeze rustled her hood. She tugged it lower over her forehead, ensuring her hair was well hidden. The last thing she needed was for someone to recognize her. As a Xanthian traveling through the kingdom of Shindair, her dark skin and tall frame already made her stand out. The pointed rooftops of the crowded buildings around her drew her gaze, and the Emperor's castle loomed before her. She hated being back in Valestron Bay. The city's sweltering humidity was oppressive under the weight of her robes. The air even smelled like sweat. Aurelia wove through the narrow, quiet streets with the stiff demeanor of a noblewoman and a shadow knight. There were few people brave enough to be out in the middle of the night, but those few still scurried away at the sight of her. It wasn't long before she found herself standing before the castle gates. A caravan had arrived at the city recently, and merchant carts were scattered around the walls. In the morning, this area would be packed with people conducting business as they bustled in and out of the castle. But for now, it was empty, except for 2 guards standing on either side of the gates. As she strode forward, the guards startled and held their long staffs out between them, blocking her access to the entrance. Aurelia pulled herself up to her full height and stepped closer, allowing them to see her robes and mask. "I have business with the Emperor," she said, her voice low and raspy. The sound nauseated her. Shadow Knights revealed their identities only to those in their closest circles. They spoke in hoarse, whispering voices to remain unknown to everyone else. The guards paused, then stood at attention. One guard cleared his throat. "Of course. Our apologies, good knight." His voice had a squeaky edge to it. They lifted their staffs and moved to open the gates. Aurelia resisted the urge to let out the breath she'd been holding. Instead, she marched through the opening in the castle walls, allowing her familiarity with the fortress to propel her forward with confidence. As soon as the guards closed the gates behind her, the silence weighed heavier on her shoulders than the humid air. The courtyard was empty, and the walls blocked the small amount of noise from the city outside. Aurelia tried to ignore the deafening click and clack of her steps across the cobblestone. She lifted her chin high as she approached a side door to the castle. Jameson should be here. At least, that was the message she'd received. A shadow knight lounged against the stone walls beside the door. Jameson. It took a moment for the knight to notice Aurelia hovering before him in the darkness. His own robes glittered in the small amount of moonlight peeking from the clouds above them. Here we go. This was the first test of Aurelia's plan, and of her trust in Jameson. Was this a trap? Possibly. But he had always kept her secrets, and she'd kept his. She had to believe she was doing the right thing. The knight straightened, dragging himself away from the wall. The shadow dragon reigns. And he will come to us over the sea, Aurelia said, returning the greeting and matching the knight's hoarse voice. The knight gave a slight nod, then lingered. Aurelia recalled the words she had carefully memorized, the code phrase Jameson's messenger had given her. She had to be sure it was him. I've been away from the Valestran Bay for some time. Has the Emperor been well? She paused and waited for the correct response. The knight relaxed and leaned against the wall again. Nothing has really changed. Aurelia's heart raced, sending a sharp pain through her chest. This isn't Jameson. Where was he? Maybe he had sent her into a trap. But Jameson knew the cost of betraying her. He wouldn't take the risk. Would he? It wouldn't be the first time she'd been too trusting. Ganon's warm, smiling face appeared in her mind, but she brushed it away. She liked to believe she had learned her lesson, that she was more discerning now. But perhaps not. It would be too suspicious if she left abruptly. She would have to talk her way out of this. His plan must be going well, at least, she said, as she stared at the sky, forcing her body to relax. It's cloudy tonight, but no storms. The knight followed her gaze, but he shook his head. I think it's coming. He just hasn't grown angry enough yet. He hesitated, then shrugged. Wish he wouldn't kill so many of them. We could always use more knights. Aurelia's blood turned to ice, even as the sweat poured down the back of her neck. How many more lives had been lost? How many had they been unable to save while they searched for a way to defeat the Emperor? But she couldn't dwell on that. As always, she would save her guilt for later. It would come as a haunting reminder when she longed to sleep. May the Shadow Dragon guarantee his quick success, she said, the whisper in her voice hiding her grief. Her only option was to go inside. She moved to the door and opened it, watching the knight cautiously. He was already lounging again against the stone. Aurelia cringed as the door creaked shut. She closed her eyes and breathed. Shadow Knights didn't cringe. They didn't tiptoe through halls or carefully close doors behind them. She opened her eyes. Now what? She would have to leave the castle through another door and make her way out before anyone discovered her. She didn't know what Jameson was up to, but she wasn't going to wait to find out. The numerous corridors all looked the same, but Aurelia remembered them well. Torches lined the walls. Their light danced and cast shadows before her, but the flames were comforting. As soon as she escaped these castle walls, she would find Lucy and leave Valestran Bay. A flash of purple blended with the fire in one of the torches ahead of her. Aurelia stopped. Something buzzed behind the flames. She readied her hands at her side, prepared to strike. Are you coming or not? The small purple someone hissed. Chapter 2. Wings peeked out from behind the torch, flapping rapidly. Vandra. The small purple fairy kept herself hidden in the shadows, bouncing from one torch to the next. Aurelia dropped her hands and followed, but her feet dragged with each step. Never trust a fairy. That was what everyone said, anyway. But Aurelia knew Vandra, and their old bond of trust hadn't faded. She trusted Vandra more than she trusted Jameson. The fairy had delivered Jameson's message a week ago. "Please," she'd begged, her eyebrows furrowed over her deep purple eyes. And Vandra never begged. "He needs help." Aurelia blinked, driving the memories from her mind. She was about to lose sight of Vandra. She glimpsed the fairy's shocking purple hair just as it disappeared into an obscure doorway. The hallways here were darker, colder. They were closing in on the dungeons. The pounding in her chest eased. Jameson was telling the truth. They were going to pull this off. But why hadn't he met her at the door? Vandra was flying too fast. A purple flash hurried around the corner, and by the time Aurelia reached it, there was no sign of the fairy. This hall had many more doors and turns. Where had Vandra gone? Aurelia crept toward the dungeons, hoping she remembered the way. She couldn't wander through the halls aimlessly, allowing a shadow knight to suspect her of being lost. The dungeons were just around. She turned the corner and almost ran into him. A shadow knight turned his large black eyes to face her. Aurelia forced herself not to jump. Stay in control. "The shadow dragon reigns." The knight's voice was coarse, yet sharp. "And he will come to us over the sea," Aurelia responded, but she didn't disguise her voice quite as well as she'd have liked. Focus. But where was Vandra? The knight stood in the middle of the corridor, and Aurelia waited for him to step aside so she could pass. He didn't move. Aurelia's pulse quickened. Her hands itched with a familiar warmth as a small flame grew inside her fist. A light appeared and began to cloud her vision. "Have you been here on duty, or are you returning from an outside patrol?" the knight said, and Aurelia paused, allowing her light to fade. The flame disappeared. "I've been away from Volestron Bay for some time. Has the Emperor been well?" she asked. She narrowed her eyes. Every muscle in her arms and hands tightened as she braced herself for the knight's response. "No, sadly," the knight said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "He's been under the weather." The twitch turned into a full smile. Aurelia folded her arms across her chest, wishing Jameson could see her glare. "I told Vandra that was the dumbest code phrase I'd ever heard," she said, dropping the raspy voice and speaking clearly. I hope she relayed the message. "It's probably my favorite stroke of brilliance yet." Jameson's voice had a gruff edge, which didn't match his wide smile. "We need to go, now." He abruptly strode past Aurelia in the opposite direction. But Aurelia didn't have time to object. She was about to lose Jameson as quickly as she had lost Vandra. Where was he taking her? "Why didn't you come to the meeting place?" Aurelia hissed as she tried to keep pace with him. Their starry robes billowed out behind them. "I had to be sure, so I sent Vandra to scout instead." "But I gave you my word that I would come alone." Jameson came to a sudden stop and turned. His smile had faded. "Your word," he said, his voice strange and level. "What took you so long?" Aurelia hesitated. This wasn't like him. "I came as soon as I could," she said, but he turned to keep walking as if he hadn't heard. Aurelia scowled. "You sent Vandra with your message, but you left me to make the plans. I had to figure out how we were going to get in and out of Volestron Bay safely." Jameson grunted. "Oh, yes. You don't make a move without planning every detail first." Aurelia glared again at his back. "My plans will get you out of here safely. We still have to—" She paused. "Where are we going?" Jameson faced her again, a wide smile spreading under the pointed nose of his mask. It was forced. Eerie. "We're going to the Great Hall," he said, and then he stepped forward, closing the space between them. Aurelia was tall, slightly taller than Jameson, but his presence was intimidating nonetheless. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What have I done? More mistakes, more miscalculations. Her well-laid plans never worked out the way she expected them to. Jameson was still smiling. He looked around at the empty passage. The torchlight hit his shadow just right, enveloping Aurelia in darkness. He leaned in and lowered his voice to a whisper. We're going to steal a dragon egg. Chapter 3. Aurelia was sure her bulging eyes were as big as the eyes on her mask. She had to resist the urge to draw on her light and melt the smug smile off Jameson's face. Have you lost your mind? She hissed, her jaw clenched shut. Did you make up a rescue mission just to get me here? When she was back in Xanthias, she had questioned Vondra's message from Jameson and whether she should trust it. The other protectors had refused to help, insisting it was too risky. But she'd stuck her neck out and vouched for him anyway. She had considered all the options, all the nefarious reasons Jameson could have had for bringing her to the Emperor's fortress. And yet, he'd still managed to shock her. The corner of Jameson's mouth twitched again, but his smile remained. I don't have time to explain, but your clever plans have changed, he whispered. Think what it'll mean to the protectors. A real fire dragon egg. Aurelia folded her arms across her chest. You've lost it. It's too dangerous, and there are other ways. We need to... Jameson lifted a finger to his mouth. Voices. The noise echoed from down the hall. Could their conversation have been overheard? Jameson motioned for her to follow him, and Aurelia complied. What else could she do? This was a bad idea. The voices faded as they arrived at the great hall. Jameson pulled Aurelia into a small alcove with a single door, a door that wasn't far from the Emperor's throne inside. It was rarely used, except by the Emperor's steward or shadow knights. Jameson reached for the doorknob, but Aurelia slapped his hand away. What is going on here, Jameson? She said. And no more games. You know we can't just take the egg and leave. That's exactly what we're going to do, Jameson said. He reached inside his robes and removed a large egg carved from wood. I've been making plans of my own. For the second time that evening, Aurelia found herself momentarily speechless. Jameson continued, the words rushing from his mouth. The egg is in the Great Hall, lying under an embroidered cloth, and guarded by 2 knights. Vondra will take care of the guards. Swap the eggs and leave. You'll be gone before anyone knows you were here. Aurelia snatched the egg out of his hands and placed it inside her robes. Something still didn't make sense. If I do this, how does this help you? I didn't come here for a dragon egg, she hissed furiously. I came here to save... Aurelia stopped short as Jameson ripped off his mask. He wasn't young, but his haggard expression displayed the hardened lines of a much older man. Flecks of gray peppered his black hair. The laughing blue eyes she remembered from long ago were now only bleak storm clouds. It's too late, Jameson said, and his voice broke. Aurelia's mouth gaped open. Too late? How could she be too late? It had only been a week since she'd received Jameson's message. She'd arrived as soon as she could. After all, she couldn't complete a mission like this without consulting the protectors first. And Emperor Scarden wouldn't... Aurelia tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry. Jameson stood like a statue before her. His jaw was set, and his mouth had formed a hard line on his face. Jameson, Aurelia started. What could she say? I had no idea. It doesn't matter. I watched and did nothing. But we tried. It doesn't matter. Jameson looked away for a moment. When he turned back to Aurelia, some of the storm clouds had left his eyes. They were a steady, clear blue again. This is how I make up for it. Aurelia lifted her mask and narrowed her eyes. And what about you? Would he still want to leave with them? Jameson shrugged. I'll be fine. He put his mask back on and cleared his throat. I have to leave you here. I can't be nearby when it happens. He stepped away, but Aurelia grabbed his arm. Meet us at Grimm's Tavern tomorrow evening. You can't stay here, she said. We can all leave together. Jameson nodded, and then he was gone. Aurelia replaced her mask and opened the side door to the great hall. Her legs were numb, and her eyes scanned the enormous room. To her left, large windows covered the wall, teasing her with the clear, starry sky above. She longed to be outside in the open night air, far away from this miserable castle. To her right stood the Emperor's throne, and a pedestal with an object on top, covered with a delicate purple cloth. On either side of the pedestal, 2 shadow knights slumped, apparently stunned by Vondra's quick electric shocks. A lump formed in Aurelia's throat. Ganon. But of course, it wasn't him. These knights were still breathing. They were simply knocked unconscious. Ganon's body had been lifeless when Emperor Skardan blasted him with tremendous bolts of electricity. He'd slumped in his Shadow Knight robes on the very same floor. And it had been her fault. Ganon had tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen. She'd thought her plan was better. Just as she had believed this time. But no matter how much she considered her plans, no matter how careful she was, someone always got hurt. And someone had died again. Aurelia blinked and scanned the rest of the room. She was otherwise alone. All she needed to do was swap the egg, and she could be gone before the knights woke up, before anyone was aware of what she had done. Or Skardan would find her here and kill her. And where would Lucy go? What would the girl do on her own, so far from home? Aurelia shook her head. She should leave the castle now. Taking the dragon egg was far more than she had been prepared to handle. She turned, but something made her pause. The floor. There were scratches and burn marks on the floor. It's too late. Jameson's words echoed in her mind. How many people, how many children, had fought for their lives as they stood on these floors? Aurelia spun around and rolled her shoulders back. I'm not a coward. Ganon had fought for these children, and he had died because of her cowardice, not because she was too careful. She would deal with her own guilt over Ganon's death later, as she always had. She had more immediate problems. Jameson had trusted her to come to his aid, and she was still too late. How many more would die because of this egg? Because she did nothing. Maybe Jameson's plan wasn't so crazy. People can always surprise you. Aurelia took a deep breath. Everyone has the power to do some good, no matter their past. Even her. After all, her own past wasn't much better. Chapter 4. Aurelia tiptoed over the Shadow Knights beside the pedestal. Neither guard moved. She pulled her pouch out of her robes, removing the wooden egg. Then she gently lifted the purple cloth embroidered with intricate silver dragons. And there sat the dragon egg. A fire dragon egg. It was small enough to fit in her pouch, but much larger than a regular chicken egg. The shell glimmered with bright red swirls, as if it had been painted. Aurelia wished she had more time to admire it. She slipped the egg into her pouch and replaced the cloth with the dummy egg underneath. One of the knights groaned. Aurelia yanked back her hand, and the cloth shifted, exposing the wooden egg. The room was silent again, but it wouldn't be long before the knight awoke. Aurelia hastily tossed the cloth back over the egg. Another groan, louder this time. The fabric was partially askew, but it would have to do. Maybe they wouldn't notice until she was gone from the castle grounds. She slipped back to the side door. The knights didn't move. So far, so good. She opened the door slowly, walked through, and then closed it delicately behind her. "Hey!" A shout came from inside the great hall. "Where's the egg?" Not so good. Aurelia took off in a sprint down the hall. She felt as if she were on fire. Her senses were keenly alert to the sound of the Shadow Knight running far behind her. She turned corner after corner, hoping to lose him while still getting out of the castle, fast. Thankfully, her feet carried her through the paths she had learned long ago, and she made it back to the entrance where she was supposed to meet Jameson at her arrival. That seemed like ages ago. Aurelia shoved open the door. "What?" The door had slammed into the knight on guard, who was leaning against the wall again. He froze, mouth agape, as Aurelia barreled through the door. She ignored him and dashed to the buildings in the courtyard, hoping they would give her enough cover as she ran. The knight at the door shouted, and Aurelia could hear his heavy steps racing after her. Aurelia clenched her jaw and pushed harder despite the burn in her legs. I'm getting too old for this. And yet, a small smile formed across her face, even in her fear. She loved a good chase. As she reached one of the buildings, an icy blast hit the wall next to her. A frost seeker. She wanted more than anything to hurl a fireball back at him, but fire would bring too much attention to herself in the night. Besides, her light would blind her, and she could really use her vision right now. Aurelia continued to dodge icicles and blasts of freezing wind as she zigzagged through various workshops, which seemed to grow around the castle. And then, the gates to the castle wall came into view. She bolted toward them, hoping the knight was still far behind. "Stop her!" the knight shouted. The guards stood at attention next to the gates. They weren't shadow knights, but they were still an obstacle. Aurelia veered right and spotted the watchman's ladders leaning against the castle walls. She glanced over her shoulder. The knight was sprinting after her, and the guards charged forward to help. There was nowhere else to go. She leapt onto the ladder and clambered up. Her hands were sweating, but she ignored the sensation and concentrated instead on climbing. She was almost there. She felt the cold before it reached her. The world slowed around Aurelia, and she ducked as the icy blast hit the ladder and her fingers instead. She gasped, struggling to hold on. Her fingers were frozen, but the palms of her hands began to slip on the icy rungs of the ladder. Maybe the chase had finally caught up to her. She drew on her light, pulling small flames into her hand to warm her fingers and melt the ice. She couldn't do much more, or else she would burn the ladder. More icicles hit the rungs above her, shattering in pieces over her head. He missed again. The knight must not be practiced enough in using the shadows, which would allow him to see while using his power. Aurelia's foot slipped, and she cried out in pain as her hands held on. The feeling had returned to her fingers, painfully so. The pain in her fingers sent her mind reeling, and she again thought of Lucy. Aurelia had saved her life all those years ago, but at an unbearable cost for the girl. Always a little too late. Always a step behind. But Lucy was alive, and Aurelia wasn't going to let anything else happen to her. She gritted her teeth and pulled herself to the top of the ladder, ignoring the freezing sting in her hands. In one swift motion, she swung her legs over the ladder and onto the wall. Freezing ice covered the spot where she had been, and the knight was climbing up behind her. Aurelia cried out as she released fire from her hands and onto the ladder. The light, a blinding white light, filled her eyes until she lost all vision. She heard the knight's scream, the crackling flames, and then a thud as the knight and ladder fell. She withdrew her light and allowed the fire to disappear from her hands. Her vision returned, and she stared at the scene before her. The knight had indeed fallen, and the ladder was a jumble of ashes and wood piled on top of him. New guards were running along the walkway on top of the wall, closing in on both sides of her. Aurelia turned to face the city outside the castle walls. There. She stretched her arms out to each side and screamed as she used all her strength to draw on her light. Flames streamed from her hands and down the walkway. She let her light disappear, and her vision returned. The fire around her was almost as blinding as the light. It spread along the top of the wall, stopping the guards from reaching her. She blinked, but she had already seen where she needed to go. Aurelia jumped. The merchant's tent and stand broke her fall. A fruit stand. Aurelia groaned and scrambled out of the tent, ignoring the bruises she would pay for later. Why couldn't it have been a silk stand? She rushed through the merchant caravan to the side streets, thankful for the pointed roofs and tall buildings providing her cover. The shouts of the knights and guards from the castle faded as they lost her trail. Aurelia didn't stop running until she was safely back at the home of the protector who'd been hiding them. She collapsed to the floor, too winded to move. Lucy startled and sprang up from where she had been sleeping, her short red curls flying around her face. Aurelia ripped off her Shadow Knight mask and pulled the pouch out of her robes. She hoped to the great dragon that she hadn't damaged the egg. "What's in there?" Lucy said. "And where is—" Her eyes widened as Aurelia removed the egg from the pouch. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating Lucy's shocked face and the glittering red dragon egg. "Our plans have changed a bit," Aurelia said, and she slipped the egg back into the pouch. I hope you enjoyed listening to Behind the Shadow Knight's Mask by Jessica Deen Norris, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Jessica, go to jessicadeennorris.com to find more of her books. Make sure you sign up for her newsletter while you're there so you can get the ebook copy of this story as well as a coupon for her store. I'll have a direct link in the show notes. We've got some Christmassy episodes coming up, but I also know a lot of people will be looking for more. So if you have a friend who's looking for Christmas stories to listen to, make sure you send them to the podcast. I'll go ahead and throw some easy sharing links in the show notes for our previous Christmas episodes. That way you can share them with your friends or listen to them yourself. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.